Lyra Ashveil had been called many things in her life. Cursed, dangerous, wrong. She had learned, over 23 years, not to argue. Arguments required energy she did not have. They required the belief that the other person might actually listen. She had stopped believing that a long time ago. She was small and quiet, and easy to overlook, which was the only advantage her life had ever given her. She used it well. She kept her left wrist covered at all times, a strip of dark cloth wrapped twice around, hiding the mark that had decided her fate before she was old enough to understand what a fate was. The sigil had been there since birth, a looping symbol, silver pale against her brown skin, like someone had written a word in a language nobody living could read anymore. Her grandmother had called it a stain. Her pack elder had called it a warning. The children she grew up with had called it ugly and moved away from her at meals. She had called it nothing. It was just part of her arm. She was arrested on a Tuesday. 6 soldiers found her at the northern border, where she had been picking wild herbs near a stream. She was not running. She had no reason to run. She had not done anything. That turned out not to matter. One of the soldiers grabbed her wrist, pulled back the cloth, saw the mark, and looked at his partner the way people look at each other when a decision has already been made. They chained her hands in front of her. The metal was cold. She did not cry. She had long ago decided that crying in front of people who had already decided you were guilty was the most useless thing a person could do. The throne room of King Calum Draven was the largest indoor space Lyra had ever stood in. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was dark stone, polished until it reflected the torchlight in long orange streaks. On either side stood members of the court, men and women in fine clothes, watching her the way people watch something they expect to be unpleasant. She walked between 2 guards with her wrists still chained. Her boots were wet from the stream. She had a cut on her knee from where one of the soldiers had pushed her down during the journey. She was aware of all of this, and chose to carry herself as if she was not. Calum Draven sat at the far end of the room, on a throne carved from black stone. He was tall even sitting, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair, and the kind of face that had stopped being young without becoming old. His eyes were gray and very still, like water that had frozen over. He looked at her the way you look at a problem. Lord Varen Orsk stood to the king's right, a thin man with a careful smile and the patient eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. It was Varen who spoke first. This woman was found at the northern border on the night of the raid that killed 6 of your Majesty's soldiers. She bears the sigil of the Ashveil bloodline. Calum's gaze moved from Varen to Lyra. Cursed, he said. It was not a question. It was a filing of information, the way you label something before you put it away. Lyra looked at him directly, not with anger, not with fear, with the specific, worn-down steadiness of someone who has been declared a problem by people in authority so many times that the declaration itself no longer surprises her. I was not at the raid, she said. No one said you were present, Varen replied smoothly. We said your mark appeared. That is not the same as being there. It is close enough, Calum said, and that was the end of it. He sentenced her to imprisonment pending execution. The words fell like stones into still water. The court murmured its agreement. As the guards turned her toward the door, every person in the room heard it, a sound from outside the palace walls, low and resonant, like the earth itself had exhaled. Then silence. One of the court guards near the window went pale. Your Majesty, he said slowly, the sacred wolves are at the gate. Nobody moved for a long moment. The sacred wolves were not creatures anyone in that room had expected to see in their lifetime. The oldest texts described them, enormous, white as snow in winter, eyes the pale gold of candlelight. They had last been seen 300 years ago, and the scholars had mostly agreed they were legend by now. They were not legend. They were 12 of them, sitting in a perfect line at the palace gate, not growling, not pacing, simply sitting, as though they had arrived for an appointment and were prepared to wait however long it took. Calum went to the window himself. He stood there for a long time. Then he looked back at Lyra, still in chains between her 2 guards. Something moved behind his frozen gray eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but something that looked like the first crack in ice. Put her in the east cell, he said. Not the dungeon. The east cell was not comfortable, but it had a window. Lyra sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall and looked at the small square of night sky visible through the bars and thought, as she often did, about her mother. Her mother had worn the same covered wrist, had walked through the world the same way, quietly, carefully, taking up as little space as possible, as though apologizing in advance for existing. Her mother had died of a fever when Lyra was 9, alone in a corner of a building their pack used for storing grain, because no one had wanted her in the common sleeping hall with a mark like that. Lyra pressed her back harder against the cold stone wall. On the second night, someone slipped a blade under the door. She heard the scrape of metal on stone and was already moving before she was fully awake, rolling sideways, getting her feet under her, putting her back in the corner. A guard stepped into the cell. He was not one of the regular night guards. His eyes were flat and deliberate in a way that told her this was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. He moved toward the water basin in the corner. He was going to drown her. The cell wall exploded inward. There was no other word for it. The stone simply burst open, not gradually, not with any warning, and a sacred wolf stood in the gap it left, enormous and white and absolutely still. It looked at the guard once. The guard dropped to the floor and pressed his face against the stone and did not move. The wolf walked into the cell, turned in a slow circle, and sat at Lyra's feet. She stood in the corner with her heart going very fast and looked down at it. It looked up at her with its pale gold eyes. "Hello," she said, because she did not know what else to say. Calum arrived within minutes. He stood in the broken doorway in a dark coat, no crown, and looked at the guard still flat on the floor, the gap where his wall used to be, and the sacred wolf sitting calmly at the feet of his prisoner. Lyra was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside it. She had her hand resting lightly on its back. She looked up when Calum arrived. "I did not ask it to come," she said. "I know," he said. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he said, without looking at her, "You will be moved to the upper rooms tomorrow. Am I still waiting to be executed?" He did not answer immediately. "I am still determining what you are," he said finally, and left. She found, to her own surprise, that this was the most honest thing anyone in authority had said to her in years. He came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. He came with questions about the sigil at first, practical, careful questions, the kind a man asks when he is trying to solve a problem. She answered them plainly. She had no reason to hide anything, and no energy to perform mystery. Somewhere in the second week, the questions changed without either of them noticing. He asked her where she had grown up. She asked him why the north border had been left with fewer soldiers than the east. He answered. She noticed he was surprised that she had noticed. The wolf slept outside her door every night. Sometimes a second one appeared. Calum stopped commenting on it. The archivist was old and walked with a stick, and owed no one anything. His name was Soren, and he was the only scholar in the palace willing to look directly at Lyra's wrist. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "This is not a curse," he said. "I know," Lyra said. "No, I mean it is not a curse in any sense. It is a binding seal. Someone put this on your bloodline intentionally, to keep something safe inside it." He set down his stick and lowered himself into a chair and told her the history she had never been given. 300 years ago, the sacred wolves had pledged themselves to a bloodline, not to a crown, not to a territory, not to a king, to a family. When that family had been killed in a war no one recorded honestly, the last survivor had sealed the covenant into the bloodline itself, locked it inside, the way you lock something valuable in a box and give it to someone you trust. The sigil was the box. Lyra was the one who had been trusted. She sat with this for a long time after Soren left. She sat so still that one of the wolves came inside and lay down beside her, its warm weight pressed against her side, and she put her face against its neck and breathed until she felt less like the floor was moving. She had been called a curse her whole life. She was, in fact, an inheritance. Varin Orsk moved on a Thursday. He had been moving for years, actually, quietly, patiently, the way water finds cracks in stone. He had been the one who ensured Lyra's family was pushed to the far borders. He had known what the sigil was for a long time. He had been hoping the bloodline would simply fade away, through poverty, through isolation, through the ordinary grinding violence of being unwanted. The sacred wolves appearing had ruined everything. He worked quickly. He poisoned the opinions of 3 border lords against Calum, forged letters, called a vote. 5 members of the council voted to remove the king. Varin named himself acting regent. He ordered Lyra executed at dawn in the public courtyard. He had done the math. If she died, the covenant died. The wolves would scatter. He would be untouchable. The courtyard was gray and cold before the sun came up. Lyra stood in the open air without chains. She had refused them, and Varin had allowed it, deciding it would look better if she appeared simply resigned. She was not resigned. She was paying attention, which is a different thing entirely. The executioner raised his axe. And every sacred wolf in the world arrived. Not 12, not 100. She did not try to count them. They came over the walls and through the gates and across the rooftops, and they filled every edge of the courtyard until the stones were white with them, and they sat in absolute silence, and they waited. The axe came down. It stopped. The executioner's arm simply stopped moving, mid-arc, as though it had met something solid that no one could see. He tried again. He could not. He stepped back with the face of a man whose understanding of the world has just been quietly reorganized. Lyra opened her eyes. The seal on her wrist had opened. Not broken, not destroyed, but unfurled, like a letter that had finally been delivered after a 300-year journey. The light it gave off was silver and very quiet, not threatening. Warm, the way things are warm when they have been kept in a cold place for too long. Calum came through the crowd. He did not have a weapon. He did not call for the guard. He walked directly to her and stood between her and the executioner, and the way he moved was the movement of a man who has stopped calculating what it will cost him. He looked at Varin across the courtyard. Varin ran. He did not get very far. The palace took 3 days to settle. There were meetings and oaths and the formal removal of Varin's titles, and a great deal of paperwork that Lyra wanted no part of. The court wanted to celebrate her. They used words like champion and chosen and blessed. She smiled at each of them politely and felt nothing, which was something she had become very good at in rooms where people had recently decided to like her after a long period of having decided to destroy her. She went to the tower room, the one with the window, the one that had been hers, not a cell, not a palace suite, something in between, for these strange weeks. She sat on the floor, old habit. She heard him come up the stairs. She recognized his footsteps by now without meaning to. He sat down on the other side of the door. "I am not going to give you a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I called you cursed in front of everyone I govern. I put you in a cell. I nearly had you killed because it was administratively convenient to believe the worst of you." He paused. "I have spent 2 days trying to work out how to make that right. There is no clean answer." "No," she agreed. "I came anyway." She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the door. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had recently put it down and was not entirely sure what to do with his hands. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him. "Ask me something real," she said. He thought about it. "Are you afraid of them? The wolves?" "No," she said. "They are the first thing in my life that looked at me and did not immediately decide I was the problem." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter. "That is going to change," he said. She studied him carefully. 23 years of reading rooms, reading silences, reading the space between what people said and what they meant. All of it pointed in the same direction. "I know," she said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The wolves below shifted in their sleep and settled again. Outside, the sun came up over the palace walls, slow and very gold, and the courtyard that had been cold and gray at dawn filled with ordinary morning light, and the wolves stretched their great white bodies in it, and Lyra sat by the window and watched, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like something that needed to be covered up.